hate groups have leveraged the internet and the new technology and are recruiting lots of new members. And finally, how the economic downturn and the election of the first African-American president has stoked hate group activity. Our recommendations in the report include that leaders across the political spectrum set a tone for a civil national discourse on comprehensive immigration reform, ensure a strong law enforcement response to violent bigotry by enacting the Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And third, complement tough laws and vigorous enforcement with initiatives designed to reduce prejudice. In an increasingly diverse America, no civil right is more fundamental or more important to the functioning of our democracy than our government's role in protecting individuals from the acts of violence because of their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, gender, or disability. Although bigotry cannot be legislated out of existence, a forceful, moral response to hate violence and hate speech is required of everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Nancy Keenan, you mentioned Bill O'Reilly's defiance after the murder of Dr. Tiller. And one of the things I was struck about was what we at Media Matters call the Republican noise machine. That's the conservative media that constantly churns this stuff. Virtually nobody, they spent an extraordinary amount of time explaining away why Bill O'Reilly had no responsibility whatsoever. And I didn't hear a single voice within that community. Even mainstream pundits suggest that maybe he did something wrong, or that suggest maybe the movement should cool it, or suggest that there might be a connection with violence. Frank Rich last weekend wrote about the enablers in all of this. And is that one of the reasons it's happening? We've seen such a dramatic increase now versus the 90s. There seemed to be some sort of adult supervision back then, whether within the media, the conservative media, or the Republican Party. And there seems to be a vacuum there now, and it's a race to the fringes.
Well, I think it was to your point earlier about Rush Limbaugh, and that back in the 90s we didn't see this kind of very specific name calling, very specific intimidation, harassment, language, and kind of building a culture. It really is a culture of acceptance around that. And absolutely, we didn't see anybody call him out. And again, he denied it, and there's proof obviously from your work. He said it, it's on video, and then he tried to blame everybody else. You know, oh, it's a politically motivated thing, they're just trying to get me. And then again, the defiance. He just absolutely refuses to tone it down even more, or stop it. And I think, you know, we talk about, somebody mentioned this whole issue of free speech, and there is, we all value free speech, but when you cross that line, when it becomes personal, when it becomes the specific name calling, when that is turned into specific attacks of violence, that's when it has crossed the line. To do a vigil, to do something across the street, to protest is one thing, but to specifically target people, target them by name, by action, by violence, by voice, that's when it's crossed the line here, and no one has called it out. And I think that, quite honestly, in this country is deplorable, that nobody has called him out.
Anyone else have any other thoughts about who might step forward within the, either the Republican Party or the conservative movement, or is that not going to happen?
Well, one of the things that we have seen is, you know, when extremism starts being legitimized, the first casualty is public civil discourse and public debate. And so we have seen even some members of the Republican Party who have dared speak up against the vitriol, let's say in this case on the immigration issue, being attacked, you know, and it's turned into a feeding frenzy by these same public figures and talk radio personalities and cable news shows. You know, Steele, who is the current target of our petitions, asking to repudiate this kind of language that is happening right now and that it's coming into evidence in the Sotomayor nomination. And if you've been following that, you can clearly see the hypocrisy in those who say, well, this is not about Latinos, this is not about ethnicity, it's about immigration. When you see how that has spilled over into the Sotomayor arena, even though it has nothing to do with immigration, it's a clear indication of how this is not about immigration. This is much deeper than that. And so we saw when Steele raised his voice in some caution against Limbaugh, he was eaten alive. So I think that there's going to have to be a stronger stand and a more concerted effort and a broader effort from the leadership of the Republican Party to disavow itself from that. Again, on the issue of immigration, I think the biggest irony is that this is a centrist issue where there's a great deal of consensus. If you look at the polling, not only recently, but from years past, the majority of the public, of voters, are in favor of what really is a comprehensive immigration reform solution. And yet, the way that this debate has been covered, and by providing a platform to these voices and they're gaining legitimacy, what you have painted is a debate that is completely polarized, where there's absolutely no consensus. The intimidation that comes with that polarization, we have seen very clearly. A couple of years back in North Carolina, they were having a debate about the DREAM Act, which has to do with undocumented students, young kids. There was broad support for it from both sides of the aisle, from former governors and the current governor. And then the anti-immigrant groups came on board and started calling these members. And little by little, those members started withdrawing their support for the legislation. But it wasn't just because they were getting calls about people saying they oppose this. They were being threatened. People were being threatened physically for standing on this issue. And it has created a real dangerous line from some elected leaders, elected officials, to really take a stand on an issue because they're afraid of the consequences. And that definitely is crossing a line. And so, again, we've done a lot of work with Media Matters. They've documented this imbalance in coverage that has led to this polarization, where you have these voices being repeatedly legitimized with no balancing point of view. And when you do have another point of view, it tends to set up that dynamic where it's somebody who also has extreme views on the other side, and it keeps obscuring the fact that there's actually a great deal of consensus. So I also wanted to mention a couple of resources that might be useful to you. NCLR, as a response to this environment, launched its Wave of Hope campaign, wecanstopthehate.org. And there you can find videos on America's immigration legacy, which talks about the different groups that in the past have been demonized. Heidi talking about the connections between many of the main spokespersons for anti-immigrant groups and their connections to white supremacy and hate groups. And the code words of hate narrated by our colleagues at the Anti-Defamation League.